Okay, so my first question before we start is, has anybody tuned in, Rima? Do we know?
No.
No. Okay. Rima has a question, sort of out of the blue, but that's okay once in a while. Rima, what was your question?
What can I do with my wood ashes when it comes to the garden,
All righty.
if anything?
If anything, wood ashes will raise your pH. So whatever your starting line is, and you should know what that is, you need to do a soil test.
Mhm.
By the way, we do them in the fall for free, the Master Gardeners here in Allegheny County. And so, well, it's only the middle of summer, but come September, down at Tinkertown Hardware Store, several of us from Alfred that are Master Gardeners will be there, and you bring your soil samples and we'll do the chemical magic and tell you what your pH is, or we hope we will. Every now and again, we're not sure, but anyway. So if you have an average Allegheny County soil, which runs around 6.6, 6.8, slightly acid, that's fine for almost all your vegetables. Some like a slightly higher, more neutral pH. Off the top of my head, that would be perhaps your peas, perhaps your asparagus, definitely your herbs, almost all of them that come from the Mediterranean, like basil, lavender, all of those. However, as I've often said, I am not the expert on everything. So you go online or you get a book. I hunted through all my books the other day for our next topic, and for some reason I couldn't find anything on it. So Rima is going to do the research for me. It'll take her about 10 minutes. Probably for most of you, you'll be going online and you want to find out general vegetables from the garden, their preference for pH.
Okay.
And you probably get one page, maybe 2 pages. This is all asparagus down to zucchini. And then it will tell the optimum pH range for them to grow in. And as I said, most of them grow very well between like 6.2 and 7 even, but a few of them like it a bit higher. So if you're growing those few,
Yes.
Once again, let's not dump an inch of ashes, just a light sprinkling, a dusting.
Okay.
And then, check your pH again after 6 months. Remember, well, we haven't really talked about this, but it takes 6 months for everything to adjust. Sorry, guys, no instant. It takes a while for certain chemical reactions to occur. So that's, and your lilac-bushes, did I mention that? They tend to like a closer to 7. So there's quite a few things. And then what I would do with the extra reamer, you live out in the country, just toss it.
Okay.
Maybe on your lawn or your hayfield, because as I recall, the farmers used to lime their fields every year to sweeten the soil, to make it more. Hay, I think, grows better around 7 or 7.2. So that's where you could get rid of your extra.
Okay.
All right. So no one else called in questions? So look, it's kind of interesting. I was thinking about this yesterday when I was going over my notes. I'm of the type that goes way back in our human history. I'd much prefer sitting around the campfire at night, dispensing wisdom or information or storytelling. And this sitting here in front of this machine, and sometimes there's people's faces on it and sometimes there's not.
Right.
I know a lot of people listen to it afterwards because they can't do it right now. And once in a while we have somebody here. But for me, it's very strange. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that. Okay. Our topic basically today is what we do with the garden in the last half of the gardening season, which is a good 3 months. Now, our gardening, we can garden here from the middle of April to the end of October. That's almost 6 months. So we're halfway through. And unfortunately, as you drive around, all the eager beavers that were out there tilling up their garden and planting and whatever, now you see a lot of weeds. and they just sort of abandon the garden in the heat of midsummer. And that's kind of too bad. But there's a few things we need to talk about before we get to our main topic. So let's do that first. It seems to me, because we're having a very dry year after 3 very wet years, nothing like the average anymore, it's one or the other. For me anyway, there are not many slugs. And I haven't seen a Japanese beetle yet. Don't tell anybody.
I have.
You have.
I have.
I haven't. I'm sure they'll come. I'm sure they'll come. But the watering, we talked about watering, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago. I have a rain gauge. Everybody should have a rain gauge, because they don't always tell you on the news how many inches you get in a week. And you need about an inch a week to keep your garden growing. So in May and June, and now we're in halfway through July, so I haven't added anything up yet. But in May and June, we had less than half the average rainfall, right? So now we're down about 3-4 inches on the average for this time of the year. So things are really drying out. So you have to pay attention to the watering, okay? A few hints about harvesting some things earlier than you would normally do.
Okay.
Most people plant their potatoes, I'm guessing, in late May. I do mine in late April. Most people still probably bury their potatoes 6 or so or 8 inches into the ground. I don't do that. You remember, 2 inches and then lots of loose mulch on top. Now, sometime in the middle of June, if you plant early and they're not frozen out by a freak frost,
Right.
they start to bloom. And usually about 2 weeks after that, there's one potato that's of 2-inch diameter. Now, potatoes, if you were to dig up your hill, one potato plant right now, you would find anywhere from 6 to 10 potatoes on the roots. One might be 2 inches in diameter, a smaller one, all the way down to marble and pea size. So you don't want to do that because you're going to really reduce your harvest. But if you plant shallow with a pile of mulch on top, you can sneak your hand in there, sort of like the vet doing a check on a poor horse that has colitis. You know what that is.
Yeah.
And find the big one, the alpha potato, and just pull it out. And I've done that now. I have 15 in a row. I have 2 rows. So every 2 days or so, I don't eat potatoes every day. I go down the next potato plant, wiggle around, and pluck out my potato for dinner, leaving all the rest to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So that when you finally harvest them in September, hopefully you'll have 6 to 8 good size 2 to 3 inch potatoes, depending on the variety. These are my early red potatoes, by the way, which are shorter season than the longer Kennebecks. Okay, potatoes. If you planted out your onion sets or seedlings, remember I said you plant them twice as close as the final onion is going to be in the row. Now they're all beginning to bulb out. And so you can start harvesting every other onion in that row to leave space for the remainders to fill out to those big 4 or 5 inch onions that you're going to get in September. All righty. I hope you've staked your tomatoes. If you haven't, probably you can still do it. And so every week now they're growing, like Jack's beanstalk. You got to go out there at least once a week and keep tying them up so they don't just flop over. Also remember, we're not eating the tomato leaves. We're eating the tomatoes. Now, if tomato plants are left to themselves, hopefully you've thinned to 1, 2, possibly 3 main stems that are going to grow up, like Jack's beanstalk. The rest you've trimmed off. But what's going to start happening, the main stem, the side stem where the flowers and tomatoes will be, and in between, right by where the leaf stem leaves the main stem, you're going to see a sucker growing, 2 little leaves,
Mm.
which will become another branch. And all it will do mainly is make more leaves.
Okay.
Now you need
Not tomatoes.
not tomatoes. So since you're not eating the tomato leaves, you don't want that for 2 reasons. It takes away from the energy of the plant.
Mm.
You want the energy to all grow into making your tomatoes. Now, you do need leaves for at least 2 reasons. One is they make the food for the plant,
Mhm.
but tomatoes will get sunburnt just like you will if there's not enough leaf cover, and you don't want that either. So it's a judicious pruning. All righty, tomatoes. Pumpkins or butternut squash or perhaps cucumbers. Now, over the decades, the botanists have been breeding shorter stemmed pumpkins and the butternut squash I grow is more of an heirloom. And if you plant it in good soil, one tiny little seed will produce by the end of September a good 20 feet of vines in all directions into your garden, over the lawn. So you don't, and once again, well, I suppose if you're selling them, because I do remember I plant my pie pumpkin and my butternut squash, both ramblers, not the new bred. They only grow 5 feet, maybe. I plant them on my old compost heap, and so they have lots of rich soil. So for the first years, when I used to be a potter and I could sell the extra at my craft fair when I went to sell my pottery, I do remember being amazed. It was a good year, plenty of rain, it was nice and warm. That one teeny tiny seed produced 18 butternut squash.
Wow.
You know, the foot long, probably 3 pounds at least, and 12 pie pumpkins. So I don't need that many now. Now Rima gets usually 1 butternut squash from me and some of my other friends. I figure I don't need all that rambling, making squashes and pumpkins up until the frost time. So I start them in early May indoors. By late May, I put them out. They're about this high then. Put a box next to them because, you know, you're going to get surprised by a frost. But by now, 4th of July, middle of July, they're starting to expand like Mr. Putin into other territory. So you just go out with the scissors and you snip them off. You keep them within whatever area you have put them in your garden. Sorry, guys, you got to stay in this 8 by 6 foot space. And once again, I will get probably 8 to 9 butternut squash, which is enough, and maybe 6 pumpkins, which is enough. All righty, pinch pie. Okay, now the secret. This is the best. How many of you, if you've lived long enough, it's called serendipity. What's serendipity mean? I'm gonna put you on the spot again. I looked
Good
that
luck.
up. That's a
Fate.
connotation, an unusual
Karma?
circumstance that usually is considered good luck.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is a good thing.
But it's a
Serendipity.
off the wall, out of the blue kind of event that no one's expecting. One year, if you're a gardener, you never go anywhere during the frost possible season, which is from us middle of May, late May, when you put things out early, or perhaps in the fall when you're getting ready to harvest your green beans. You don't go away because you never quite know what the weather is going to be. So one May I went away. I was going to be for 3 nights with friends, and we listened to the weather report the second day, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, literally, it was going to be 25 degrees here at night in Alfred.
No.
And my pumpkins, etc., were out, and they were about this high. And I thought, oh, that's not good. So of course, when I came home, dead, flat, 25s will kill pumpkins,
Yeah.
dead. So there it was. Now, I don't know why I did this, but I thought, well, perennials die every year. but then in the spring they come back from their crown or their root system.
Okay.
And I really didn't know what the pumpkin's root system was like, but I thought, do an experiment, Mary Lou. And I just cut off at the ground level the dead, watery, blackish leaves. Guess what?
Did it come back?
It came back. And so
Wow.
I didn't get my pumpkins quite as early as normally I would. They were like 2 weeks behind because they had to start over, although they had the root system, the little root system at that point. So anyway, that happened years ago, maybe 15. Slow. Normally what I used to do with my green beans, I would plant in mid-May, the seeds, and by 2 months, by early July, usually I'd have start beans. And they only lasted about 2 weeks. You'd pick them every day or every
Yeah.
other day. But for me, after 2 weeks, all the flowers were gone. They weren't going to make any new beans. So I just pulled them up and planted something else. And 3 summers ago, I remembered the pumpkin. And I thought, what if I just cut them off 2 inches above the ground? In other words, you get rid of all the leaves, just leave the stem and maybe 2 or 3 branches. I wonder if they'll come back. Within 4 days, I had new leaves, all fresh and young,
Wow.
no rust, no nibbles from the Japanese beetles.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I short-circuited the time from planting to harvesting by a good 2 weeks, because think about it, you put the seeds in the ground, even in warm weather, it takes at least 5 days for them to sprout.
Mhm.
And then it takes a week or so to form the root system as the plant grows. But if you've already got the root system there,
Mhm.
and everything, the ground is warmer than it is in spring, if you keep it watered in dry times, you will have, some of those green beans are 50 days. But you're going to be, like within 6 weeks, you're going to be having green beans, which means middle of July by the beginning of September. And normally that will give you a whole nother month to pick your second crop of green beans or wax beans or purple burn beans.
How far did you cut them off from the
I left
ground?
about 2 inches
Okay.
above the ground, got rid of all the leaves, but depending on how it branched, sometime it was just one stem, but usually it was 2 or 3 stems.
Right. Okay.
So you give that a try.
Yeah.
Saves on seed, saves on about 2 weeks of time. All right, that's all. Not really in lieu of our talk. That was just things that had to be caught up at this time of the year. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go out in the garden, and if you planted things when you should have, which most people don't still, but next year maybe you will. By now, at least a third of your garden, depending on what you grow, is sitting there empty, because your peas should be gone or almost gone. Your lettuce and your spinach are definitely gone. It's too hot for them. Your carrots are probably gone. So your beets, so your radishes, all those early green onions, all those early crops that like the cool weather are done.
Our broccoli starting to go to seed.
Yep.
It's flowering.
No, you don't.
It's flowering.
You don't mean really flowering, too old.
It's trying.
Well, it doesn't like this weather.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Broccoli is not, for me anyway, this year was not good.
Yeah, they're only about.
They're little in there. Yeah.
And they're starting to
Well,
turn
that's
yellow.
the water, I suspect. And also, back in the day before global warming, we had everybody hated it, but it was good for certain things. A long, cool spring. And it didn't start getting hot until the 4th of July, really. The old joke was, hey guys, what do you all do around here in the summertime? And the answer was, anybody out there remember? Well, on the 4th of July, we go swimming. And that wasn't far off. The ponds around here never warmed up.
Mhm.
So all those cool loving crops that really love nights in the upper 40s, low 50s, in the daytime in the upper 60s, the poor broccoli and spinach don't have a chance to
Yeah.
really do their thing in the spring. All right. Okay. Now you have to do some 6th grade math. Most, especially if they're reputable companies, if you buy a seed packet and it has no information on it, don't buy from them again. They're too cheap to put down the basic information that you need. And all the reputable companies will do it. The better they are, the more information you get. So usually you'll see days to germination. That means if the weather is proper for that particular seed, eggplant might need 3 weeks if the ground isn't warm enough, whereas lettuce will almost always germinate in 4 days, unless the ground's frozen. So you take that date and then it says average date to harvest. Average date. Sometimes the summer is drier or cooler, then it takes a little longer. If it's warm and wet, it might be a little sooner, but use that as an average. So let's make it real simple. Let's say my green beans are a 60-day variety. And once again, the more experienced you get, there are probably 20 at least varieties in common, in the horticulture world, and they're all different. Some might be just 50 days, some 60, some 70. So if you have a short season, don't try and grow the green beans that take 70 or 80 days to mature, because then you need another 2 or 3 weeks to harvest them. So go for the shorter time from planting to harvest. So our 60-day green beans. Now we have to not talk about, oh, we had a frost in August. Yes, once in a blue moon. No, less than in a blue moon. Those of you that took my astronomy class knows what that means. It doesn't happen as often as a blue moon. We do get a frost in August, but that is very, very, very rare.
Yeah.
Last year, the frost in the fall didn't come to the middle of October, the killing frost. That's unusual, even in this day and age. So you have to go by averages. So let's say the average last frost is going to be on the 1st of October. And you want at least 3 weeks maybe to harvest your beans. So that means they have to, around the 10th of September, they have to start making beans big enough to pick. So you go back, if it's a 60-day, that's roughly 2 months. So that's what, the first week in July, around the 10th. They should be in the ground. Okay, so you do that with whatever. So here are some of and mainly what you're going to plant, except for the green beans, are all those early crops that you planted in April, because they will appreciate the weather as it gets cooler into September and later October. And they have a short enough growing season that you can eat them before they freeze. So they would include, let me see, the beans. Oh, and then you have to think about how hardy are they? And they don't all belong to the same club. The ones I'm going to suggest you can plant, the green beans are tender, which means if you get 32 degrees out there and you haven't covered them up with a towel, a blanket, a sheet, a box, whatever, they're going to freeze and die. You're going to have a frozen mess. So they're tender. But then you have 2 other categories. Well, 3 really. 2 others. Half hardy and hardy. Now the half hardy, I think I just thought of this. Us older folks tend to get bundled up in the winter because we feel the cold more. But the college students run around in shorts, no hats, no scarves, no mittens. They're the half-hardy kind. They can deal with a bit of frost. So that would be like 28 degrees about. So if you, let's see, what would fit in that category? Your carrots, your beets, your radishes, your green onions, maybe your lettuce and spinach. I'm not quite, so there might not be quite that cold tolerant. But those others, you don't have to worry about covering them up if it's going to just drop to 28 and you trust the weatherman. And then you have the hardy ones. Actually, they go down to 22 degrees, which is hard to believe. But I've seen some
That's
college
cold.
students, the macho men running around at
I have
22.
too. Little T-shirts. Oh,
Yeah, with t-shirts, right. Those are the hardy ones. And they would be your peas. What else? Your Brussels sprouts, if you grow them, and your parsnips and regular old peas. Now, one of the reasons peas are better off in cold weather, they're higher. Usually they're up on a trellis. And you could do an experiment. You could go out on a day when it's like just frosted. There's white frost, just 32 on the ground, and hold a thermometer for a few minutes until your arm gets too tired, up above your head, take the temperature. Then do the same thing at your waist and then on the ground. Chances are it's 1 to 2 degrees if the night is not breezy, if it's absolutely still, because cold air sinks. And so it's always colder on a still night and when it's around the frost freezing line. So anyway, so your peas are more likely, or the tomatoes at the top of a 7-foot pole, the ones that kept growing, they might escape for another day or two. Okay, so these are all things you can plant now for later. All right, in general, in mid-July, obviously the ground is a lot warmer than it was in the middle of April. And it's probably going to be drier unless you have an unusually wet summer. Now that's just the opposite of what most of these seeds that you grew in early spring want. They want a damp soil and they want it cool. So how are you going to do that? Or how are you going to go about planting these things? Well, first of all, those bigger seeds, the spinach, peas, beans, and radishes, I would soak them for maybe 2 days. Remember how we did that?
Yeah.
You let them sit for a day in the water and then you drain it off and then you keep them damp for another day and a half so that they're tricked into thinking, oh, it's time to start swelling, start growing, start germinating. So that's what I would do first. And once again, I've never done it with lettuce and onion seeds, but there's no reason why you can't. But remember with the carrot seeds, which are so teeny tiny, and you try and trickle them out, and then you spend an hour or two thinning them 3 weeks later, because there's just a million of them. So I mixed the carrot seeds with sand, remember? And once again, it can be slightly damp sand, but not wet, because when you plant it 2 days later, you want it to be able to be dry enough to crumble apart, not sopping wet.
Okay.
Stir, but you know what? Lettuce seed is also fairly small, and so are the onion seeds. Say you want to grow green onions again in the fall, scallions. Why not mix them in with the sand also? Different sand, 3 different bowls. Stir them real well. You don't want all the seeds in one part of the sand pile. Okay. Then on the day you're going to plant, and once again, the theory is great, but we often don't follow the theory because it doesn't fit into our schedule. If you're going to know it's going to rain that night, it's good to do it the day before, but sometimes you just have to do it when you have to do it. All right. So what I do then early in the morning, now you might want, if you're on a well, you might want to start saving water with this dry summer. You don't want to run out. So just sprinkling the whole garden might be wasteful. If your garden, hopefully new gardeners, you did this, if you could, ever so slight a slope, 1 to 2 degrees. No, not 10 degrees where you're going to wash everything away. So early in the morning, I would just go out and say I'm planting peas and I want to put them down 2 inches. Well, peas are a little different because we don't plant a single row. We use the hoe 4-inch wide and we make a 2-inch deep trench. But everything else is just a single row usually. And the smaller the seed, the more shallow the trench. So all these are going to be between 2 inches to 1/2 inch deep. And then turning the hose on fairly low You don't want Niagara Falls roaring down your trench. Turn it on medium and put it at the head of one of those prepared seed trenches. And I'm guessing, depending on how long your row is, mine are about 20 feet, and how dry your soil is, it might take up to a half hour for the water to gradually work its way down the trench. When you see it percolating out the end into the lawn, it does not need to be watered because then you have to mow it. Move it over to the next trench. So this might take 2 to 3 hours, depending on how many rows you have. But what you're doing is, well water especially is cold. So you're cooling down the soil and you're thoroughly wetting it. Hopefully, remember, soil is 1/4 water and 1/4 air, and the rest is soil. So hopefully you have filled up all the air spaces now with water. And that trickle has gone down, I'm hoping 6 to 8 inches. All right, then you plant your seeds. And we won't go over this because we did it before, or it tells you on the package how deep and how far apart. And then with your hoe, you very carefully cover them and gently tamp down. Then you mulch, because now we're in the hot summer and this year it's dry. The mulch will keep the moisture in longer. It will keep the soil cooler. And let me think. Right. But you don't need that much. You know, in the spring, when you mulch something, you want it to last, especially like the potatoes, 4 months. Now we only have about 2 months or so to worry about. So I would say no more than 1 inch on your big seeds, peas and beans, and 1/2 inch on all the rest that are finer seeds. That should be enough to keep most of the weeds down and help with the moisture retention. Then, because I have a cat who thinks the garden is her litter box, I have some heavy duty fencing that's about 2 feet wide or so. So over these areas, newly planted, newly watered, newly mulched, I lay down the fence until a week or 2 or 3 after they come up and they begin to establish themselves, that they're saying to the cat, no, don't you dare. And usually she doesn't bother digging in the garden when the plants are up. Okay. Also, I've discovered there's something at night, a skunk, a possum, probably, that's been digging in my mulch looking for worms because everything is so dry. Yep. Out in the fields and the lawns that aren't being watered, the worms have gone down. So they're messing up my mulch looking for food. And then I water it again, this time maybe with the sprinkler, so that it has a good soaking to get started. All right, rule number 2, besides, plenty of water and mulching and fencing, you need to rotate what you planted where. Now, we're not going to go into details because next time we're actually going to talk about why we rotate the veggies in our garden. And Rima's going to really help me with this because I couldn't find any of my own books that I kept or my notes on the topic. So she's going to look it up for me. Anyway, simply where my peas were, I'm not going to replant peas there if I decide to do peas again. I'm going to put in my carrots or my beets or my onions or my lettuce or anything else. And the same thing where I had my block of carrots, now I'm going to put my block of beets or my green onions or my lettuce. Just shuffle it up, and we'll talk about why next time. Okay. Now a few hints for special things. Lettuce and spinach especially, but lettuce also, do not like, in spite of what the breeders are trying to do, they still do not like the hot sun. What's that? Is it Noel Coward? Only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the noonday sun?
Is that Noel Coward?
I think so.
No.
It's a song. And I think it has to do with playing tennis. But anyway, you can look it up. They just don't like it. They wilt, they get bitter, they want to bolt, which means go to seed. So if you're determined to have a lettuce patch or row in the middle of summer, once again, look up the varieties that have been bred to deal with that, and there are some. The Israelis are very good at this since they live in a desert country. That's the one country that pops into my head that breeds seeds that do well in the hot, dry. But surely somewhere in your garden, you're going to have something tall. For me, it's my row of asparagus, my row of raspberries, and if I did more than one, it'd be a row of tomatoes that grow up 4, 5, 6 feet high, which means by 1 in the afternoon, maybe 2 at the latest, if you plant your lettuce and spinach, any kind of green, on the east side, they're going to have afternoon shade. And anybody like me who really hates the heat, I'd rather go in the woods and work in my woodland garden in the shade than out in the hot sun where the garden is. So keep that in mind. We don't want to have to go running around building lattices, over our cooler loving plants. Or with the lettuce and especially the spinach, you can wait till August to plant, because once again, those crops will linger on until October. Now, I did forget something about that when I was talking about the hardy. There are 2 crops in particular, maybe 3, but definitely Brussels sprouts. If you've never, I don't like Brussels sprouts, but my daughter grows them. And evidently, like parsnips. Now, do you ever grow parsnips?
I haven't, no.
No. That's more of I think of a colonial old-fashioned kind of vegetable that's gone out of favor. But they look like carrots, except they're creamy white. And they usually, some varieties get bigger. And they withstand frost very well. As a matter of fact, the old guys, the old housewives, you would never dig them up in the fall. You would leave them in the ground to freeze. And then in March, April, when the thaw came, you dig them up and eat them, because the freezing, before I give the answer, we'll play Socrates, and you're the student, Rima, sitting on the other end of the log. I'm going to ask you a question. Where do you store your potatoes?
In the cellar.
In the cellar. What's the temperature, would you say, in the cellar?
50s.
50s. What happens if for some reason you put them in the fridge for a week or 2? Have you ever done that?
I have, and I think it started to sprout in the eyes.
Well, that's because they were old and ready to sprout. What about their taste? Do you remember what happened to their taste?
Bitter.
Sweet.
Really?
Something in the potato, when it's chilled down to like 40 degrees in your fridge, the carbohydrates change to sugar, which of course is what is opposite of what happens with corn and peas. If you don't eat them fresh, the sugar in them turns to carbohydrates and they're not as sweet. Well, in potatoes, we don't want them sweet. We like them to taste like potatoes, whatever that is. But with parsnips and Brussels sprouts, having sat around, the Brussels sprouts, say to Thanksgiving or even Christmas, out in your garden until it gets really, really cold, maybe down to 15, will sweeten up. The sugars will be, the carbohydrates will change into sugar. And that's the same with parsnips. So if you grow parsnips, and a lot of people don't do that anymore, you might want to consider, if you plant them now, they're more like a 90-day crop, as I vaguely remember. So if you plant them now, they won't really be of size till like the end of October. So also, you can leave carrots in the ground, but you don't want them to freeze, and beets in the ground, but you don't want them to freeze. So let's talk about those 2 things, parsnips and carrots and beets. If you don't have a basement for storage and you actually have a big garden, maybe you eat a lot of veggies or you have a big family, where am I going to store all these carrots? I don't have a garage, I don't have a basement. So what you do is come, say, the middle of October, when the frost begins to get serious, you cut off the tops of the beets, you eat that, tops of the carrots, And then if you have access to some spruce boughs, you lay them down on the row. You want an airy mulch. You don't want a sodden mess. And then just pile on maybe 8 inches of loose, fluffy leaves and pine needles. And you can then probably, well, who knows in this day and age, maybe all winter long, but in the old days, it used to be you could go out into the garden then and dig up a few beets, a few carrots, every 3 days or so, remulch everything and go through December before the mulch no longer can keep the ground from freezing. And you can lightly mulch your parsnips, but you don't care, you want them to freeze. So they stay over the winter, they get frozen. Now, the only problem is if you have a lot of, and remind me, when we're done with this, let's look it up, because I can never remember which is which. Mice and voles. One eats bugs and one eats the roots or the potatoes or the whatever. So we're going to find out. If you have a lot of voles and mice, then you may have a problem with this because they will rummage around and cause problems. What is our time? Well, we have quite a bit of time today. How did that happen? Don't know. All righty. And nobody's tuned in to ask questions, right? All righty. Well, then I'll toss in an off-the-wall idea that I had because most people don't bother these days. But there are a few diehards or people that love a challenge or love their fresh lettuce or whatever, or are very competitive. And they have a cold frame that functions all winter long. There's actually a few, what's his name? He lives up in Vermont. Coleman, I think, was it? And he wrote a book 10 or 20 years ago about up in Vermont, a huge cold frame in which he grew greens basically, and radishes, I think, and maybe green onions all winter long. He'd go out and sweep the snow off. Well, you have to be dedicated to do that. But if you wanted to do that, cold frames can be as simple, or as expensive and complicated as you want. In the old days, it'd be a couple of bales of hay with an old window that you're not using on top. Then, the next simple would be the wooden ones that you build. And usually the back side is higher than the front side because, remember, the angle of the sun determines the amount of heat you get from the sun. And if your garden slopes 2 degrees to the south, it's the same as moving your garden 140 miles to the south. So they would build their cold frames with the soil slightly sloping north to south. The back end was higher. And then if they were really fussy, the top would be glass or plastic, and so would the south front side. So all the sun could shine in. Because remember, in fall and winter, the sun is much lower in the sky. And quite often old farmhouses didn't have a lot of landscaping around them. So once again, you don't want to tromp to the back 40 to your cold frame for your lettuce for dinner. So right by your kitchen door or your front door, whatever the south side of the house was, you'd put it right up against the south side of your house. And even though it's minuscule, no, what's the word? Little. There is some, say?
Minuscule?
Yes, the word I can't say for some reason. There are certain words I just can't get out. All right. There is some heat leakage. So all those little itsy bitsies. I remember my friend Wolf years ago when he planted his grape vines, which in those days in Allegheny County, except for Concord grapes, was unheard of. You just couldn't do it. There was a stone wall foundation from an old barn, and it was 8 feet high. Beautiful laid up stone, no mortar, and it was about 15 feet long. And on the south side of that stone wall, he planted his 3, I think, grapevines on a trellis, but were right against that stone wall, which of course, if there's any heat around, soaks up the heat in the daytime and then gives it back at nighttime. So anyway, then that's all manual labor. You can build it from odds and ends. It won't cost you anything but time. Or if you have the money, you buy these fancy new ones made out of all sorts of fancy materials. They're actually computerized. Some temperature. The lid goes up and down depending on what the temperature inside is, according to what your computer has been programmed. Can you believe? I think that's true. I know they have temperatures, and I know they have some automatic, you don't have to keep track. Because what happens if it's late November and we have this weird, all of a sudden it's 60 degrees and it's sunny? Well, if you don't open up your lid, you might cook everything in there because it just gets so hot. So you can do that if you want. Okay, I'm out of topic. I could mention this. Do you have any questions to round out our hour?
No, actually, you just answered the last one that I had.
Which was?
Well, so we have a greenhouse, but it's very small and narrow. And I was thinking it's a passive solar house.
Okay.
And so the greenhouse is on the south
Side,
side.
it should be.
Yeah. And so in the winter, sometimes it warms that space up enough that we can open the doors
Yes.
into the house and warm
Right.
the house.
Right.
So I was thinking if I planted things like lettuce in there, it would be great unless it got really hot in there. What do I do? And you just said, like, basically you
Well,
open the door.
yeah, open the door or lift up the
Yep.
lid or
Yep.
open the window or whatever it
Right.
is. Yeah. Okay. All right. I had another, this doesn't quite fit in, but it sort of does in that it's like, I think most of us maybe love flowers more than vegetables.
Mm.
And I think when Jack Frost really puts his foot down and it's the end of the season and the last of the flowers are dead, we all feel kind of like, oh. And it used to be in late September. So then it was October, November, December, January, February, March, a good 6 months, if not more, before we had flowers again. Well, I'm going to suggest a combination that you can plant near your front door. Mine happens to be in an L, and the part that I plant faces east. So by noontime, it's in the shade. So it's plants that don't need all day sun
Okay.
or all day shade, but they will bloom starting in late February now, can you believe, with Lynn Phelan's snowdrops. Late
Yeah.
February, early March, there they are. All the way up to Thanksgiving. If once or twice in that time period, October, you toss a sheet. Now, my particular garden is very small. It's only like at the most 8 feet long and at the most, what, a foot and a half wide. So it's not a very big one, but once again, a tiny space with flowers off season, excuse me, is wonderful.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So here's what I suggest. I wrote down basically the ones that bloom in the fall, but if you can get hold of some snowdrops, they'll be blooming definitely by March, if not late February, if we have an early spring. Then, what happened? I got a cough. Violas, which are, I suppose, the grandparents of violets. I'm not sure if they're the same family, different varieties. You could look that up. But violas look very much like pansies, but they're smaller, more like a wild species. And they come in shades of white and lavender and purple mostly. And once you start them, they tend to either be perennial and live year to year, and or they self-sow. So their children replace them the following year. And the violas will also start blooming by the end of March, usually. And then what happens? They're more of a cool weather flower. So they bloom for about 2 months, March, April into May. Then I shear them. And they kind of sit there for a week or 2 or 3, and then they regrow their leaves. And then once again, later in the summer, they start blooming. Sometimes I shear them 3 times. And they will bloom unless you have a really horrible freeze up until Thanksgiving time. And they're not weedy like violets. Lobelia which is an annual, I believe. So you have to start it every year. And it's also shades of dark or light blue. And it too will start blooming quite early in April through a couple of cool months. Then you shear it back and then it'll come back and bloom once again 1 year all the way to Thanksgiving. Lobelia. I have some Dwarf Columbine, which has begun to self-sow in my rock garden. So I moved one, and it only grows about, 6 inches high. And my particular variety has a pink Columbine. And so I moved one of the self-sown ones over into this little nook because it holds its foliage nicely all year long.
Yeah.
Sometimes that leaf miner gets in, which is 30 years ago, there wasn't such around here, but it's moved in from wherever. And so when that starts to make those little brown roads in the leaves, usually in June, I just cut them off to the ground, makes new leaves. Meanwhile, the whatever it was, where's the restaurant? My restaurants disappeared. So usually that's what I do with that. What else? Oh, sweet alyssum. That's another thing that keeps giving once you do it. Years ago, I had a package. I like the dark purpley kind, and then the lavender purpley sweet alyssum. And I started it early, in March or April, put it out early in May, but it self-sows. So now I don't have to bother with that because every year, here and there, and then if I'm fussy and don't want it there, I just either dig it up and throw it on the compost heap or transplant it. So what you have in the spring and then later in the fall, things sort of peter out a bit in the heat of the summer. For me, it's a lavender, purple, blue, but there are other color combinations you could come up with. So the white snowdrops, the violas, the lobelia, the sweet alyssum, those three definitely. And then the columbine. Now there's also some dianthus, which are dwarfs, grow about 6 inches high. And they come in shades of white or pink or rosy or whatever. Once again, you can pick your variety. And they have a nice blue-green leaf also when they're not blooming in May. So what else? There are crocus that bloom in the fall. Fall blooming crocus. Totally different than the ones in spring. And they're different varieties. Many of them are lavender. Some are white, but most of them are lavender. One of them, which doesn't last here for more than 3 or 4 years, it dies out, is the saffron crocus. Which, by the way, saffron is the most expensive food in the world.
Yeah, I believe it.
I forget what it costs, like $18 an ounce or something. Don't quote me, but it's outrageous.
It's very expensive, yeah.
That's because it takes, once again, I'm going to forget, something like 5,000 crocus flowers to make a pound. And it takes the women doing the work, of course. It has to be handpicked.
Right, yes.
But I did grow it for a few years, Stradivarius or whatever it's called in Latin, the Saffron Crocus, and it's purple, lavender purple, with an orange stamens. But that's not so hardy. But some of them are, and they usually start blooming middle of September through the middle of October. And it's just so fun to see mine have multiplied and taken over my herb garden. All of a sudden, September, October, there's all these lavender crocus. The trouble with them is they make their leaves in the spring and they make just the flower stem in the fall. And so if you live on a windy hill, what I do is try to overplant them with sweet alyssum, because that's just about the right height and the color combination. So the lavender crocus, usually with orange stamens, poke up through the sweet alyssum and sit on top of it. But that holds the flower stem up from my windy hill.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but you can play around with color combinations. So anyway, if you don't have chipmunks that come and discover they love the crocus corms.
Yeah, they sure do.
So you need a cat or something to keep them. All righty. Well, I've babbled on. So if any of you folks, I hope, are listening out there at some other time, give us a call. Let us know your questions on the topic preferably. But if you have something you really need to know, maybe we can find out.
Okay,
So-
and what are we doing next time?
Next time, we're going to talk about rotation in the
Right.
vegetable garden.
Okay,
Why do we not grow corn in the same spot year after year after year?
right, okay,
Okay.
got it. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much.